Chapter 7, Section 2, Part 2. Please make sure to have your Google Doc open to complete any questions that go along with this video and submit it when you have finished. War on the Frontier. Elsewhere, other Americans also took on difficult challenges. In 1777, 24-year-old frontiersman named George Rogers Clark walked into the office of Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry. Clark said he had come to take part in defending the western frontier. He lived in Kentucky, which was claimed by Virginia. Clark wanted Virginia to defend that region against British soldiers and their Native American allies in what is now Indiana and Illinois. If a country is not worth protecting, he said, it is not worth claiming. Clark was difficult to ignore. He stood 6 feet tall, had red hair, and displayed a dramatic personality. He persuaded Governor Henry that he was right. The governor told Clark to raise an army to capture British posts on the western frontier. In May of 1778, Clark and a group of frontiersmen began to travel down the Ohio River. He recruited others on the way until he had a force of 175 to 200 men. They went by boat and later on foot to Kaskaskia, which is a British post on the Mississippi River. They captured Kaskaskia without a fight. Then they moved east to take Fort Sackville at Vincennes in present-day Indiana. Earlier, a small force sent by Clark had taken Vincennes, but British forces under Henry Hamilton had recaptured it. Settlers called Hamilton, quote, the hair buyer, because he supposedly paid rewards for American scalps. Determined to retake Fort Sackville, Clark and his men set out for Vincennes from Kaskaskia in February of 1779. Hamilton wasn't expecting an attack because the rivers were overflowing their banks and the woods were flooded. Clark's men slogged through the miles of icy swamps and waded through chest-deep water. They caught the British at Vincennes by surprise. When Hamilton and his troops tried to remain in the fort, Clark pretended to have a larger force than he really had. He also found a way to frighten the British into leaving. Clark and his men had captured several Native Americans who were allies of the British and had American scalps on their belts. Clark executed some of them in plain view of the fort. He promised to do the same to Hamilton and his men if they didn't surrender immediately. The British soon gave up. Clark's victory gave the Americans a hold on the vast region between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. This area was more than half the total size of the original 13 states. However, Fort Detroit on Lake Erie remained in the hands of the British. War at Sea. The war expanded not only to the frontier, but also to the sea. By 1777, Britain had about 100 warships off the American coast. This allowed Britain to control the Atlantic trade routes. There was no way the Americans could defeat the powerful British Navy. But American privateers attacked British merchant ships. A privateer is a privately owned ship that a wartime government gives permission to attack an enemy's merchant ships. After capturing a British merchant ship, the crew of a privateer sold its cargo and shared the money. As a result, a desire for profit as well as patriotism motivated privateers. The states and Congress commissioned more than 1,000 privateers to prey on the British. During the war, they captured hundreds of British ships. This disrupted trade, causing British merchants to call for the war to end. Many men answered the privateers' call for volunteers. Among them was 14-year-old James Forten, who was the son of a free African-American sailmaker. In 1780, Forten signed up to sail on the Royal Lewis to earn money for his family after his father died. When a British ship captured the Royal Lewis in 1781, the British offered Forten a free trip to England. Reportedly, Forten refused, saying he would never betray his country. Released from a British prison after the war, Forten walked barefoot from New York to his home in Philadelphia. He later became famous for his efforts to end slavery. A naval hero. Though outnumbered, the Continental Navy scored several victories against the British. An officer named John Paul Jones won the most famous sea battle. In 1779, Jones became the commander of a ship named the Bonhomme Richard. With 4 other ships, he patrolled the English coast. In September, Jones's vessel approached a convoy in which 2 British warships were guarding a number of supply ships. Jones closed in on the Serapis, the larger of the 2 warships. At one point, the Bonhomme Richard rammed the better-armed British vessel. As the 2 ships locked together, the confident British captain demanded that Jones surrender. In words that have become a famous U.S. Navy slogan, Jones replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." The 2 warships were so close that the muzzles of their guns almost touched. They blasted away, each seriously damaging the other. On the shore, crowds of Britons gathered under a full moon to watch the fighting. After a fierce 3.5-hour battle, the main mast of the Serapis cracked and fell. The ship's captain then surrendered. The Bonhomme Richard was so full of holes that it eventually sank, so Jones and his crew had to sail away in the Serapis. Jones's success against the best navy in the world angered the British and inspired the Americans. Even so, the Americans knew that the war had to be won on land. The next video will discuss the major land battles in the closing years of the war. This is the end of Chapter 7, Section 2. At this point, you should be able to answer a few questions. First, what role did Benjamin Franklin play in helping win the American Revolution? 2. How did European officers such as Lafayette aid America in the Revolutionary War? 3. What was John Paul Jones's major contribution during the war, and why was it important? And finally, why do you think George Rogers Clark thought the frontier was important to defend? Ideas to keep in mind as you think about answering that question is why General Hamilton was called the hair buyer, and why America might have wanted the frontier region after the war. Finally, please make sure your Google Doc has been completed and submitted through the Google Classroom. And once you have done that, you're finished, and we will see you in class tomorrow.